Then, in a flash, the veteran struck. One of the cartel members barely had time to react before he was yanked into the shadows, his weapon clattering to the ground. Another spun toward the sound, but too late. He was already down. The rest scrambled, eyes darting wildly, their confidence shattered. They had come expecting an easy job. Instead, they had stepped into something far more dangerous. The leader cursed under his breath, gripping his weapon tighter. "Fall back," he ordered, but just as they moved toward the truck, the headlights flickered on. Only this time, none of their men were behind the wheel. The engine rumbled to life, and in that moment, they realized the truth. They had never been the hunters. They were the prey. The truck's engine roared, its headlights cutting through the night. The cartel leader took a step back, his grip tightening on his weapon, but deep down, he knew, it was over. One by one, his men had vanished into the darkness, taken down by someone who had spent a lifetime in battles they couldn't even imagine. He had underestimated the quiet farmer, and now he was alone. The veteran stepped into the dim glow, his face calm, his stance unshaken. "This land isn't for taking," he said, his voice steady. The leader hesitated, then dropped his weapon, knowing there was no winning this fight. Without another word, he turned and ran, disappearing into the night. As the dust settled, the veteran watched the empty road, then walked back toward his house. He had come here for peace, and tonight he had reminded them all, some battles may be over, but a warrior never forgets how to fight. The sun was just beginning to set over the quiet farmland, casting long shadows across the fields. For most, this was just another evening in rural Mexico, but for one man, it was about to become a battle for survival. The cartel had been watching the land for weeks, convinced it was an easy target, just another farm right for the taking. What they didn't know was that the owner wasn't just some helpless old farmer. He was a retired Delta Force operative, a man who had spent his life in the shadows, trained for situations exactly like this. As the sound of engines echoed through the valley, he stood on his porch, eyes calm but sharp. He had fought in wars, led covert missions, and faced dangers beyond imagination. Now, danger had come to him, but the cartel had no idea. They weren't raiding a farm. They were stepping into the lion's den. The retired soldier had come to this land for peace. After years of service, he wanted nothing more than quiet days and hard, honest work. He built the farm with his own hands, growing crops, raising livestock, and keeping to himself. But even in the most remote places, trouble has a way of finding you. The local cartel had been seizing land, forcing farmers out, and taking what they wanted. When they came sniffing around his property, he gave them a simple answer: no. At first, they'd thought he was just a stubborn old man, someone they could intimidate, but something about him made them uneasy. He wasn't afraid. He didn't flinch at their threats. Instead, he watched them with an unreadable gaze, as if he was studying them. The cartel didn't realize their mistake yet, but as the first truck rolled onto his land that night, they were about to find out. The night air was heavy with silence as the first truck came to a stop just outside the fence line. Doors creaked open, and shadowed figures stepped out, moving with confidence as if they owned the place. The retired soldier stood in the darkness of his porch, unseen, listening. He had spent years reading people, understanding their movements before they even made them. These men were used to getting their way. But they had no idea they were walking into something they couldn't control. One of them called out, demanding that he come out and talk. Another laughed, already assuming this would be an easy job. The veteran said nothing. Instead, he watched, counted, noted their weapons, their body language, their blind spots. This wasn't just a farm to him. It was familiar ground, terrain he knew better than they ever could. And if they pushed any further, they'd regret ever stepping foot on it. The men spread out, their boots crunching against the dry earth. They moved like they had done this 100 times before, expecting nothing but submission. One of them kicked over a barrel near the barn, laughing as it rolled across the dirt. Another rattled the locked gate, impatient. Still, the veteran remained in the shadows, calm, controlled. He had faced worse than this. He had been in places where hesitation meant death, where instincts were the only thing keeping you alive. Tonight was no different. A younger cartel member, eager to prove himself, stepped forward and raised his weapon, shouting a final warning. The others smirked, waiting for the farmer to beg or run. But nothing about this man fit their expectations. He wasn't scared. He wasn't even surprised. He was waiting. Then, with the kind of precision that only years of training could provide, he made his first move. And in that instant, everything changed. Before the cartel members could react, the old soldier vanished into the darkness. 1 second he was there, and the next he was gone. The men hesitated, glancing at each other, confusion creeping into their cocky expressions. This wasn't how these encounters usually went. Farmers begged. Farmers ran. But this one? He had just disappeared. Then, something unexpected happened. A single overhead light in the barn flickered on, casting long shadows across the farm. The cartel members tensed, gripping their weapons. Was he inside? Was this a trap? The leader, a man who had seen his share of violence, signaled for 2 men to check it out. They moved cautiously, their bravado slipping with every step. Just as they reached the barn doors, a distant howl echoed through the hills. Not a coyote, not a stray dog, it was something else. Something human. And it was close. Too close. The men spun around, suddenly realizing they weren't alone. Panic spread through the group as they turned in different directions, searching the darkness. The wind carried another sound, footsteps, deliberate and steady, circling them. The leader clenched his jaw, trying to regain control. "Show yourself," he barked, his voice betraying the first hint of unease. It started as just another routine patrol until a police officer noticed something strange. A toddler clinging tightly to a man's hand, his face pale and filled with fear. The child's body language was unsettling, but what came next changed everything. As the officer approached, the toddler leaned in close and whispered just 4 words that would send chills down anyone's spine. The moment was brief, but the urgency in those small, fragile words was unmistakable. Before the officer could react, the man gripped the child's hand tighter and started dragging him away, his movements sudden and desperate. Heart racing, the officer knew he couldn't ignore it. Without hesitation, he called for backup, setting off a chain of events that no one could have predicted. What did the child say? And why did it prompt such a swift response? Stay tuned to hear how this intense story unfolds. As the officer watched the man drag the child away, a sinking feeling crept in. The area was quiet, too quiet. The streets were usually bustling, but today, there were only a few pedestrians scattered about. The officer's instincts kicked in. He knew he had to act quickly, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than a simple case of a parent or guardian losing control. There was something off about the man's nervous energy, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder, as if he feared being watched. The officer's radio crackled to life, confirming that backup was on the way. But even with reinforcements, he couldn't shake the image of the child's terrified eyes, locked in a silent plea for help. What did the 4 words mean? Why did the child whisper them at such a crucial moment? Time was running out. The officer's heart raced as he watched the man disappear around the corner, dragging the child with increasing urgency. The words the toddler whispered echoed in his mind, but they made no sense. "He's not my dad." The officer's grip on his radio tightened. That simple statement felt like a bombshell. Was this man really who he claimed to be? The officer had seen his fair share of unsettling situations, but this felt different. Meanwhile, across town, another officer, Detective Laura Hayes, was getting a call about the incident. She was just finishing a case of her own, but something about the urgency in the officer's voice caught her attention. It wasn't just a routine child welfare check. She'd worked long enough to know that when a child says something like that, especially when it's whispered so quietly, it meant trouble. As Laura made her way to the scene, her thoughts raced. Who was the man? Where had he come from? And what about the child? The answers were slipping through her fingers, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were all connected. Something dark was lurking beneath the surface. The officer's hand hovered over his weapon as he approached the corner where the man had disappeared, his every step measured,